The trucks rolled to a halt outside the wire. Tarvisio, Italy, May 8, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for less than 24 hours, but Sergeant David Kahn couldn't feel the victory yet. Around him, his fellow soldiers of the Jewish brigade stood silent, staring at the compound ahead. Inside, through the mesh of temporary fencing, 300 German women waited. Wehrmacht auxiliaries, radio operators, communications specialists, administrative staff, Helferinnen who'd kept the Nazi war machine running until its final breath. All units are assigned, the British liaison officer was saying, except one transport duty, 300 female prisoners, Wehrmacht auxiliary corps. They need to be moved north through Germany to a processing facility near Hamburg, 7-day journey, volunteer detail only. The silence stretched. No one moved. Then Kahn heard his own voice. "We'll take it." The other Jewish brigade soldiers turned to look at him. He saw the same thought cross every face. Why? The liaison officer blinked. "You're certain, Sergeant?" "We're certain," Lieutenant Moshe Goldberg said quietly, stepping forward. His Hebrew accent was thick. "The Jewish brigade volunteers." The German women couldn't believe it when they saw the arm patches, blue and white stripes, the Star of David, and above it, in Hebrew letters, the Jewish Fighting Force. One of them, a young blonde woman named Hilda Schmidt, whispered to her companion, "Juden? They sent Jews to guard us?" Her friend Greta Hoffman, older by a decade, just stared. "That's impossible. The British wouldn't," but they had. Talking about the impossible, it'd be a great possibility if you hit that subscribe button. It keeps these stories coming. To understand how two groups who should have been mortal enemies ended up on the same trucks heading north through a shattered Germany, you need to understand who these men were and what they'd been through to get here. The Jewish brigade had been Britain's grudging concession to years of pressure. Since 1939, Palestinian Jews had volunteered for the British Army by the thousands, 25,000 in total, but always scattered among other units, their identity diluted. The Arabs in Palestine had opposed a distinct Jewish formation. The British had worried about the optics, about what it might mean after the war. So Jewish soldiers from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem fought under British flags, their own heritage acknowledged only in whispers. It wasn't until September 1944, with Allied victory in Europe nearly certain, that Winston Churchill finally authorized it. His Majesty's Jewish Infantry Brigade Group, 5,000 men, 3 battalions. And for the first time in 2,000 years, Jewish soldiers fighting under their own standard. They'd arrived in Italy in November 1944, eager to face the Germans. But for months they'd been held in reserve, given rear guard duties, kept away from the real fight. It had driven them mad with frustration. These were men who'd grown up in British Mandatory Palestine, who'd heard the news from Europe with increasing horror as the reports filtered through. Warsaw, Treblinka, Auschwitz. They had families in Poland, in Hungary, in Germany itself. Families they hadn't heard from in years. Finally, in March 1945, they'd gotten their chance. The Senio River, northern Italy. 48 days of sustained combat against Wehrmacht positions. They'd fought with a ferocity that had impressed even veteran British units. The North Irish Horse had watched Jewish brigade infantry run ahead of tanks, clearing German positions with a methodical rage that needed no explanation. 57 of them had died in those battles. 57 men who'd never know what became of their parents, their siblings, their childhood friends. And then on May 7th, it had ended. Germany surrendered. The radios crackled with the news, and champagne was opened in Allied headquarters across Europe. But in the Jewish brigade camp, there was only a terrible hollow silence. Because by then they knew, the reports from the liberated camps had reached them. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The numbers were incomprehensible. 6 million, an entire world erased. David Kahn's family had lived in Hamburg. His mother, father, 2 younger sisters. He'd left for Palestine in 1936, part of the youth Aliyah movement, planning to bring them over once he'd established himself. By 1938, it was already too late. By 1942, the letters stopped coming. He'd spent 3 years not knowing, hoping, praying to a God he barely believed in anymore. Then, 2 weeks ago, a Red Cross official had shown him a document. Transported to Theresienstadt, 1943. No further records. That was when the Red Cross worker had added, almost as an afterthought, the women who processed those transport orders. Many of them were Wehrmacht Helferinnen. Just doing their jobs, they'll say now. Just doing their jobs. So when the British liaison officer had asked for volunteers to transport 300 of those women north through Germany, Khan had felt something cold and hard crystallize in his chest. He'd glanced at Lieutenant Goldberg, whose entire extended family in Warsaw had vanished, and seen the same calculation. "Why should we let someone else do this?" Goldberg had said quietly to him in Hebrew. "We earned the right." What that right meant, neither of them could fully articulate. Revenge? Justice? The chance to look into the faces of the people who'd facilitated their family's destruction? Or maybe something else entirely? The need to prove, even in this small way, that they'd survived, that they were still standing while the Third Reich lay in ruins. The German women had their own fears. Hilda Schmidt was 19 years old. She'd joined the Wehrmacht auxiliaries in 1943, recruited through the League of German Girls. They'd told her she'd be serving the fatherland, helping the brave soldiers who were protecting Germany from its enemies. She'd worked as a radio operator in a communications hub outside Munich, transcribing coded messages she didn't understand, routing orders she never questioned. When the Americans approached, her unit had fled east, hoping to surrender to the British rather than the Russians. They'd heard stories, terrible stories, about what the Red Army did to German women. The British had seemed like the better option, civilized, bound by the Geneva Convention. But Jews, Jewish soldiers with weapons and authority? The propaganda films she'd seen flashed through her mind, the caricatures, the warnings. These were the people who'd stabbed Germany in the back, who'd caused all of Germany's problems, who were subhuman, dangerous, vindictive. She'd been taught this since she was 14 years old. Part of her knew it was lies. She'd seen the regime crumble, seen the carefully constructed mythology fall apart. But fear is a stubborn thing, especially when it's been drilled into you for 6 years. Greta Hoffmann, at 31, had no such illusions. She'd been a schoolteacher before the war, educated, thoughtful. She'd joined the auxiliaries in 1941 because it was either that or the armaments factory, and she'd thought communications work would be cleaner, safer. She'd seen enough by 1945 to know what she'd been part of. She'd routed supply orders for concentration camps. She'd processed transport schedules for trains heading Iwanesin east. She'd never asked what was on those trains, never allowed herself to think about it. Now, looking at the Star of David on the soldier's sleeves, she felt something close to relief. Better this than pretending it hadn't happened. Better to face the people she'd helped destroy than to go home and rebuild a life on top of that silence. "They'll kill us," Hilda whispered. "On the road. They'll take us somewhere quiet and—" "They won't," Greta said, though she wasn't entirely certain. "We're protected, Geneva Convention. Since when do Jews follow rules?" Greta turned to look at the younger woman. "That's what they taught us, isn't it?" "That's what I taught my students. Maybe it's time we found out if any of it was true." The journey began at dawn on May the 9th, 12 trucks, 25 women per truck, guarded by 30 Jewish brigade soldiers. The route would take them through Austria, into Bavaria, across the shattered heart of what had been the Greater German Reich, and finally north to the British processing facility near Hamburg. At every stop, the stakes seemed higher. Every German town they passed through was a reminder of what had been, and the Jews were reminded of what they'd lost. Munich lay in ruins, its grand buildings reduced to skeletal shells. They spent one night encamped near Dachau, close enough that some of the soldiers went to see it. They came back silent, hollow-eyed. One of them, a young private named Josef, sat down next to Khan and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "My uncle. He could have been there. My cousins." The women, for their part, were starting to notice something odd. The Jewish soldiers weren't cruel. They didn't taunt them, didn't abuse them, didn't make threats. They were professional, almost distant. When Hilda stumbled getting out of a truck near Nuremberg, a Jewish corporal, his name tag read Levi, caught her arm to steady her. He didn't say anything, didn't look at her, just released her arm once she had her footing and walked away, and the stakes reached a tipping point when they saw what we can only describe as pure devastation. But speaking of devastation, if you're enjoying this deep dive into untold history, devastate that subscribe button so we can bring you more. The story's about to get intense. It happened outside Stuttgart on the 4th day. They'd stopped for the night in a requisitioned warehouse, the women on one side, the soldiers on the other. Khan was walking perimeter when he heard voices, German voices, speaking quickly. He moved closer to the wire separating the two groups and saw 3 of the women in heated conversation. "We should have fought harder," one was saying. a tall, severe-looking woman named Margarete. We should have defended the Reich to the last. The Reich that sent children to fight with Panzerfausts? That was Greta. The Reich that burned as its leaders fled. You sound like a defeatist. I sound like someone who's seen what we've done. Margaret's voice dropped to a hiss. You think they're better? You think these Jews, after what happened, you think they'll show us mercy? I think, Greta said slowly, that maybe we don't deserve mercy, but so far they've given it anyway. Khan stood there in the darkness, listening. He thought about his sisters. He tried to remember their faces, but it had been 9 years and memory is a fragile thing. He wondered if they'd been afraid at the end, if they'd hoped someone would show them mercy. He walked away before he could hear more. The next morning, Goldberg pulled the unit together. Some of you are wondering why we're doing this, he said in Hebrew. The German women waiting by the trucks couldn't understand the words, but could read the intensity on the men's faces. Why we volunteered, why we're treating them according to the convention when they treated our families like animals. No one answered. I'll tell you why, Goldberg continued, because we are not them, because everything they said about us, that we're vengeful, that we're cruel, that we're less than human, we prove it wrong every single day, we don't become what they are. This war was fought for something. It has to mean something. Private Yosef spoke up, his voice shaking. My entire family is dead, and I'm supposed to protect the people who helped kill them. Yes, Goldberg said simply, because that's what makes you different from them. That's what makes you human. The silence that followed was heavy, but something had shifted. The women had started to notice it too. That night, when they camped outside Frankfurt, Hilda worked up the courage to speak to one of the guards, a soldier whose name tag identified him as Weiss. She didn't know any Hebrew, barely spoke English, so she tried in German. Why are you doing this? Why did you volunteer? Weiss looked at her for a long moment. Then, in accented but clear German, he replied, because someone has to prove that civilization survives, even after everything. But what we did, I know what you did, Weiss said quietly. I know what your Helferinnen did. The orders you transmitted, the schedules you maintained. I know. His eyes were hard, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like pity. You'll live with that. We'll live with what we lost. That's the world now. By the time they reached the outskirts of Hamburg on the 7th day, the atmosphere had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The German women no longer whispered fearfully about what the Jewish soldiers might do. The Jewish soldiers no longer looked at the women with pure hatred, though the grief remained sharp and undiminished. On the final morning, as they prepared to hand over the prisoners to the British processing facility, Greta Hoffmann approached Lieutenant Goldberg. She'd been working up the courage for days. I need to say something, she said in hesitant English. I worked in communications. I knew, not everything, but enough. I could have said no. Goldberg looked at her. His family had run a bookshop in Warsaw. He'd gotten out in 1936. They hadn't. He'd learned 2 months ago that they'd been marched to Treblinka in 1942. You couldn't have, he said finally. Not really. That's what you'll tell yourself anyway. Does that matter? Does it change anything? No. His voice was flat. But you're alive. You'll go home eventually. You'll rebuild. That's more than 6 million of us got. Greta's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. I know it means nothing, but I'm sorry. It means nothing, Goldberg agreed. But I heard it anyway. As the trucks pulled away and the British processing officers took custody of the prisoners, David Kahn stood watching. He thought about his mother, who used to make challah every Friday. His father, who'd taught him to read Torah. His sisters, who'd probably be married by now if they'd lived, probably have children of their own. And he'd been pondering this question that won't let you rest. And speaking of questions, if this story's making you think, share it and subscribe. These forgotten moments matter. He thought about the 7 days on the road with 300 German women who'd helped facilitate their deaths. Women who'd been young, indoctrinated, afraid. Women who'd made choices, even if those choices had been constrained by a totalitarian system that punished dissent with death. He didn't forgive them. He couldn't. The loss was too vast, too permanent. But he'd delivered them alive to their destination, had ensured they were treated according to the laws of war, had proven that Jewish soldiers could be better than their enemies even when every fiber of their being screamed for revenge. Was it worth it? Yosef asked, standing beside him. All of this, what did it prove? Khan thought about that. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. They stood there in the morning light, these soldiers who'd fought for a homeland they barely remembered, wearing the Star of David their grandparents had been forced to wear in ghettos, carrying weapons in defense of a dream that seemed impossibly fragile in the face of so much death. Behind them, the compound gates closed. Ahead, the road stretched north, leading eventually back to Italy, and from there to Palestine, where a different kind of war was already beginning. A war for a state that wouldn't exist for another 3 years. A war many of them wouldn't survive. But that was future. This was now. They asked me, Khan said quietly, more to himself than to Yosef. One of them asked me why we volunteered, why we took this assignment. What did you tell her? I didn't. He paused. But if I had, I'd have said, because we needed to know if we were still human, after everything. After all of it. We needed to know if we could still choose mercy even when we'd been denied it. And could we? Khan looked at the compound, at the Star of David on his sleeve, at the rifle in his hands. He thought about his family, about 6 million ghosts, about the weight of being a survivor in a world that would never be whole again. We did, he said. Whether that makes us heroes or fools, I don't know. But we did. The story of the Jewish Brigade's volunteer transport of German female POWs never made it into the history books. It was a footnote, if that, one small mission among thousands in the chaotic spring of 1945. The men who participated rarely spoke of it afterward. The women they transported scattered to the winds of post-war Europe, some to rebuild, some to forget, some to live with guilt that would never fully fade. But it happened. In those 7 days on the road through a shattered Germany, something profound occurred. Not redemption, the crimes were too vast for that. Not forgiveness, the losses too unbearable. But perhaps something more important, proof that even in the darkest moment, even with every justification for cruelty, human beings could choose something else. The Jewish Brigade was disbanded in 1946. Many of its soldiers went on to fight in Israel's War of Independence, where they'd used the combat experience gained in Italy to help establish a nation. Some stayed in Europe, helping Holocaust survivors reach Palestine illegally, defying British immigration restrictions in operations with codenames like Exodus. Others returned to civilian life, carrying memories they could never quite articulate to people who hadn't been there. David Khan survived the war. He made it to Israel, fought in 48, raised a family in Tel Aviv. He lived until 1983, long enough to see his grandchildren grow up in a country his sisters never knew existed. He never spoke much about the war, but once late in life his grandson asked him what he was most proud of. Khan thought for a long time. The times we stayed human, he said finally, even when we didn't have to, especially then. If this story reminded you that history is more complex than we remember, that humanity persists in the darkest places, please share it. These are the stories that don't get told, the quiet moments of choice that define who we are. The trucks are gone now. The warehouse outside Hamburg where they spent that 4th night is luxury apartments. The road through Bavaria is an autobahn. The compound at Tarvisio is a parking lot. But the choice those men made, to volunteer for a mission no one wanted, to treat their enemies with the dignity their own families had been denied, that echoes forward through time. Because in the end, the question isn't what we do when it's easy. It's what we do when every part of us wants to do something else. When we have power and justification and the weight of 6 million dead behind us. That's when we find out who we are. Those 30 Jewish soldiers guarding 300 German women through the ruins of the Third Reich proved something essential. Not that justice had been served, it hadn't. Not that the scales were balanced, they never would be. But that even in a world broken beyond recognition, the choice to be decent still existed. That's the story. That's what happened on that 7-day journey in May 1945. And if you're wondering why you've never heard of it, why it's not in the documentaries or the textbooks, it's because history tends to remember the dramatic moments, the battles, the surrenders, the discoveries of horror. But this was just 30 men doing their jobs, doing them well, doing them with a humanity that shouldn't have been possible under the circumstances. Maybe that's exactly why it matters.